You had students, Kevin, who were being punished right off the bat for saying things like Israel has a right to defend itself. A student that I coached was told that he would have won the debate. A young black student was told he would have won the debate had he not condemned BLM for being a Marxist organization, which it itself says it's a Marxist organization. And so I didn't give up on debate. I gave up on their idea of debate, if you can even call it that. And I'm a big believer in alternative institutions.
Welcome back to the Kevin Roberts Show. You are in for a real treat in this episode because we are taking a step out of political and even policy conversation directly in order to have a conversation about conversation. With me is my newfound friend, James Fishback, founder of Incubate Debate. He's also got a great investment firm, Azoria Partners. He is someone who gave me this hat. If you're watching the video and not just listening, make debate great again. As a high school debater and one-time high school debate coach, this is going to be really exciting. We're not just going to be talking about high school debate, though, so don't turn this off. We're going to be talking about the importance of free speech, free expression, having good faith, intellectually honest conversations, something we try to do here at Heritage. So, James, I'm not sure I can provide a better lead-in for someone who's so awesome and I've been following for so long. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you, Kevin. Real honor.
We always start with someone's story. And so we'll use high school debate rules. You got 3 minutes. Go.
My story is I grew up working class in South Florida. Mom was a legal immigrant from Colombia who came here in the early 90s. My father grew up in South Florida to my grandmother, who's from Binghamton, New York, and my grandfather right here from Washington, D.C. And I grew up a great life, great childhood, because I had parents who maybe didn't have all the financial resources, but I was reminded, now that I think back about it, the importance of a two-parent household in challenging, in supporting, in really nurturing. And one thing that was a big part of my childhood growing up was in the Fishback family, you couldn't get a word in edgewise unless you were able to prove your point. You could say anything you wanted, but you were going to get peppered with questions shortly afterward. And so I growing up, some really big debates we had around the invasion of Iraq in 2003, around a guy named Barack Obama in 2008, John McCain. And so I just really enjoyed being and going to the diner on Tuesdays where kids eat free at the 84 Diner in Davie, Florida, where I grew up. And just having my grandfather to my left and my liberal cousin to my right going at it, talking about whether it's the climate, talking about tax policy. And so I did debate even before I knew what the debate team was. I get to high school and I'm missing an elective in my schedule. And they just throw me in a debate class without really any intention of it. I get there and I kind of look around and I don't really get it at first, to tell you the truth. And you as a one-time debate coach can know you either kind of get it right away or you don't. And I got it about a week later and I was just blown away by an activity where, as a freshman in high school, I was reading Foreign Affairs, The Economist magazine, National Review, quite frequently quoting the work of the Heritage Foundation in my speeches and in my debates.
Well played there.
Yeah. The last one's the most important one, right? You don't start with Heritage and then end with Foreign Affairs. But had a really fun time with it. Left high school, went off to college. And then when I left college, I came back to high school debate as a volunteer coach. I was running a hedge fund at the time, but I wanted to give back in some small way to this activity that had given me so much. I go back, and in just 4 years, from when I left in 13 to when I came back in 17, high school debate was totally transformed. It was not what it was when I left. And I said, looking back at it, what changed between 2013 and 2017 about the tolerance of opposing viewpoints and free expression? Well, a certain guy walked down an escalator in the summer of 2015, got elected, much to the chagrin of the laptop class, in 2016, and high school debate had become antithetical to everything that it stood for. You had students, Kevin, who were being punished right off the bat for saying things like Israel has a right to defend itself. A student that I coached was told that he would have won the debate. A young black student was told he would have won the debate had he not condemned BLM for being a Marxist organization, which it itself says it's a Marxist organization. And so I didn't give up on debate. I gave up on their idea of debate, if you can even call it that. And I'm a big believer in alternative institutions. I'm a big believer in what Jeremy Wayne Tate is doing at CLT, standing up to the College Board. I'm a big believer of what the University of Austin is doing, standing up to the corruption of higher education. And so we created this alternative platform called Incubate Debate. It has grown like wildfire. And really, it's not about doing something new. It's about doing something old, going back to the summer of 1787 and saying, how can we model that in our youth today? Young Americans care about this country. They're having conversations already. They're articulating viewpoints. How can we give them a platform, Kevin, to come together to talk about timely and timeless issues, whether that's the 10th Amendment and the role of the federal government vis-a-vis the states, whether that's about Israel and Gaza, or most recently, we debated the Second Amendment at our tournament just a couple weeks ago. And so that's what we stand for. Our mission is not even about debate tournaments anymore, so much as it is about teaching young Americans, wherever they are, in the classroom, at our debate tournaments, and increasingly on college campuses, we're spending a lot of time teaching them the practice of debate, which you'll know from as a high school debate coach. Well, what's a claim or an impact? How do you refute? What's a counterpoint? But more importantly, teaching them not just the practice, but the power of debate. This is a tool, as my friend Vivek Ramaswamy says, this is a tool to get to truth. And it's not your truth or my truth. It is the truth, singular. Opening up that marketplace of ideas that rewards good substance, good evidence, and good logic, and jettisons arguments that are not made in good faith without evidence. That is how we get to truth and some semblance of national unity.
If I didn't know that you were a high school debate champion, I would now accuse you as such, given that very eloquent answer. Truly. I mean, when you work at Heritage, you have the pleasure, but it's also sort of daunting, of working with a lot of people, like a few hundred people who are very eloquent, and many of whom high school debaters and a few champions among them. All that to say, this is growing. The Incubate Debate, that is. And it's growing not just because of the great plan you have there, that's where this question is going, but because it's situated in a context, time and place, where not only has free speech, free expression, intellectually honest debate gone away.
Yeah.
But there, it seems, are enough Americans, especially parents, who are saying, I want to restore what used to be. And it's not about conservative or liberal.
Yeah.
It's about the power of debate, as you say.
Right.
So give us a little bit of details, if you don't mind, the mechanics of Incubate Debate for people in the audience who may be interested, how they might get involved, how they might support it. I don't want to lose that detailed point before we move on to a related topic.
Absolutely. Incubate Debate is built on this idea that debate can happen anywhere, anytime, because it's already happening that way. I mean, we look at that presidential debate last month between President Trump and President Biden. And to tell you the truth, that was a debate, but that doesn't represent 99.99% of the debates that are happening in America. There may be some debate in this conversation where you and I disagree on certain points. That's a debate. And so what we think of debate at Incubate is the good faith clash of opposing viewpoints. That happens in the classroom, where it should, by the way. There shouldn't be some one-sided ideology imposed on students. This is the way that Angela Davis wants you to think about race. Well, why can't we talk about Thomas Sowell? Why can't we talk about John McWhorter or others? And so our belief is that, yes, we love debate tournaments. I'm a high school debater, as you said. I love the feel of going up on a Saturday and meeting kids, 100, 150 kids who are dressed to the nines, ready to go. But to tell you the truth, Kevin, if we're going to have a real impact and make debate great again, we have to reach kids wherever they are. So I just spent yesterday actually at the Sphere Summit here in Washington, D.C., meeting with teachers all across this great country on how they can use Incubate's premier format, which we call Roundtable, in their classrooms on subject matter. So imagine you're a 10th grade U.S. history teacher and World War II comes up, the events of August of 1945, which you're intimately familiar with as a historian. And instead of that short essay about whether or not this was necessary, dropping the bombs was necessary to end that war, let's have an in-class debate. Let's have an in-class debate that's directly tied to standards, that gives students a platform to articulate their own views, to show that they're right, but also to be proven wrong by their peers in this fast-paced, engaging, and educational format. Roundtable's awesome because it's a debate format that has low intimidation factor, but high reward. Roundtable is like you and me with 4 others sitting around in a semicircle for 20 minutes, and there's 3 rules. The first is no notes. As an academic, you can understand why we wouldn't want notes, because we don't want people just reading off talking points. Let's have an open conversation. The second is no standing up. The research that we've done among our students is that students are more at ease when they're just having a conversation like this, as opposed to sending Angela to the front of the room saying, well, for 5 minutes, you tell us why Truman was wrong. And the third is the golden rule. Treat others the way you want to be treated. That's the heart of civility. Everyone wants to pontificate about what civility means. It's to respect others the way that you would want to be respected. And what teachers have told us, whether they're in rural school districts in Florida or urban school districts outside of DC, is that this format engages their students in a way they've never been engaged. Let's be honest, young men and women across this country don't have a platform today where they can go up there and speak their mind, so long as their peers are able to do so in return. And so I'm really excited about, for the past 5 years, yes, having stood up debate tournaments and having had one of your colleagues, Simon Hankinson, come out and impart some really great wisdom on our students, and had Neil Gorsuch, Justice Gorsuch, come talk to our students, but also Vice President Harris's husband, Second Gentleman Doug Emhoff, talk about the importance of civility, of national unity, bringing folks from both sides together to have these conversations. But the next chapter of Incubate, which we're writing as we speak, is meeting kids wherever they are, giving teachers the tools, the resources to bring debates to life in their classroom. And second is to give parents, who we know as conservatives in this movement are the first and the most important teacher in a young American's life. And so how can a parent have the resources through Incubate Debate to spark conversation around the dinner table about something they're learning at school? I think a lot of this stuff can happen when we're talking about governmental reform and certain legislation. But at the end of the day, we can never prevent a teacher from imposing an ideology on a student. And so let's give parents particular techniques and strategies to talk with their children about what they're learning at school, and to push back, if only to show them and to play devil's advocate. Well, you learned about Christopher Columbus today. Was he a good guy after all? What is the teacher saying? How can we engage on that point? I got that experience growing up. I learned more debating with my dad and my grandfather, who was a World War II vet, than I did on the debate team about listening and about engaging in good faith. And so this movement is really a movement of students, parents, educators, and Americans of all walks of life who recognize the power of debate in bringing the country together. And so, yes, the debate tournaments are awesome. I love them. Kids decked out in Sunday's best, of course. But how can we bring the power of debate to kids through parents, through teachers, and through everyday Americans?
And it's part of it is, this sounds simple, if not just sort of silly. Part of it is making the word debate
right,
not a 4-letter word anymore.
Right.
And by that, I mean, we ought to actually relish the opportunity to be in a debate.
Right.
But the problem is we've seen all of these signals from mainstream media, from university classrooms, high school classrooms, even middle school classrooms, where to debate is to be controversial, to be confrontational.
Yeah.
And that's not the kind of debate that you and I were formed in.
No.
At least you wouldn't do very well if that's
No.
what you were doing, because there's a, as the ancient Greeks would remind us, there's a certain connection, a certain appeal to the audience as well. Where I'm going with that question is to move from the practical to sort of it's not really the theoretical, it's the historical. As a historian, I'm deeply interested in the origins of things, like when things changed. What are the origins of this disease that we have in the United States, which certainly has honored free speech more than just about any other society in the history of the world? When did that change, and why?
That's a great question. And the reality is it changes in waves. So we start off, the moment to declare independence in the summer of '76 was preceded by some pretty healthy debate at the Continental Congress. Did this actually make sense to do? What were the drawbacks? What were the upsides? What were the potential risks? And obviously the summer of 87, I think, is really the best example of good faith debate producing something that just otherwise could not have been produced in a vacuum. You had to have the debate between the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist. You had to have points of contention thrown back and forth to produce the marvelous document that is the U.S. Constitution. But there are moments where we have backslid and we have betrayed those founding principles of free speech and open debate. I think one of them most recently has been the pandemic. There were certain things you weren't allowed to say. They wouldn't let you. Well, who is they? It's actually different organizations and different groups and in different actual bodies of being. So you think about conflicts in literature, man versus system, man versus authority. Well, what if we as just Americans were sitting around in May of 2020 saying, this lockdown thing doesn't make a lot of sense. And then I quip back to you, well, are you an epidemiologist? What do you mean? What do you mean it doesn't make any sense? Or who are you to say it doesn't make any sense? Well, I'm a concerned American, and I'm seeing the effects of this around me every single day. And so that's one example of this anti-debatism manifesting itself man versus man, shutting down your fellow Americans who have genuine concerns about something, about so-called gender-affirming care for minors, and saying, well, are you a biologist? That's one example of debate. Define it as the good faith clash of opposing viewpoints. If we're just having a conversation and you're shutting down even the conversation about the conversation on the basis of my lack of credentials, you are shutting down debate. You are declaring war on debate. Now, that's an example we don't think about it all often. We think about what Twitter 1.0 did under Yoel Roth, saying, you're not allowed to have a debate about the efficacy of vaccines or about lockdowns or about masks. You put someone like Dr. Jay Bhattacharya from Stanford, who was right about everything, by the way, on a blacklist, saying he cannot trend, no matter how popular his ideas, how factual they are, he cannot trend on Twitter. When you put community ministry of truth notes on certain posts from President Trump that were historically absolutely accurate, that is thwarting debate. When you have DEI departments saying, we will not allow you to have a conversation about whether the DEI department itself should exist or whether microaggressions are actually the worst thing since the Jim Crow era. This is at the heart of it. It's this war, this attack, this suppression of our ability to even have a conversation. And so there's so much censorship going on right now in the West, and it's not just a US phenomenon. Look at the UK, look at Australia, look at New Zealand. But it's not just the suppression that is gravest when you're suppressing a particular viewpoint. The most pernicious and pervasive suppression, Kevin, is the suppression of a method. And that method is open debate. Saying you can't debate X. That's a sacred cow. There was a great clip, you may have seen it a couple years ago with Tulsi and Tucker. And it was Tucker commenting that his interactions with his DC friends when Trump rose to power, and Trump would just kind of say things like, well, why are we in NATO? And the reaction, and he would kind of, ask that and sort of vocalize it and ask his friends, well, that's a good point. Like, why are we NATO? And their response was, shut up. We can't have that. We can't even talk about that. Right. And wait, what do you mean? We can't have a debate about why we're in NATO? Why Iceland, for example, has no standing army and we have to defend them in war? And what are we getting out of it? Right?
Can't even have the debate about it.
And so I think there's interesting arguments, by the way, on both sides. I think you as a historian thinking about the events after World War II and the importance of NATO going into the Cold War. But let's have a debate about what James Baker said to Gorbachev in 1990. 1 inch, not 1 inch eastward. So the real question is, why can't we have these debates? I think as I'm writing this book, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in a moment as I'm doing this research, is there's this belief that if debate actually is, and it is, the best way to get to truth, that if we suppress debate, we effectively suppress the truth. We effectively suppress the public from understanding what is true and what is false. Debate elevates the strong. it punishes the weak, and it gets us closer to truth. We don't need to look that far back to see what happened to Biden and Trump on that debate. We were told for 2 years that Biden was just some savant behind the scenes. He was sharp as a tack. You know that phrase very well, sharp as a tack. But it wasn't until he was on that debate stage with his opponent for an hour and a half that we realized the Potemkin village fell apart in real time. So we talk about, I think we're going to write about this and think about this years from now. Ultimately, what took President Biden down was he failed at the most important and sacred method we have in America, and that is open debate. He was put up there with no handlers, with no spin masters, with none of that, and was just asked the questions and had refutation. I think people talk about President Biden's lousy job. Not enough time is spent on how President Trump rose to the occasion, stuck to the talking points that the American people care about. And ultimately, that was the cause that pushed President Biden out. We can talk about the machinations behind the scenes and so on and so forth, but that was the catalyst, was his failing at debate. That's a good thing, by the way. When you fail at debate, you should be pushed out of the picture.
And a lot of the people who suppress debate are fearful of failing at debate,
Correct.
Which is why they do it. And one of the tactics they use, the left does this primarily, is to control language. And
Right.
so one of the things that my colleagues at Heritage know I'm very likely to say when we're in some policy discourse is don't let the left control the language.
Correct.
Don't let them co-opt our words, our values. Don't accept their narrative framing.
Right.
That comes from the high school debater in me, not the high
Sure.
school debate coach, but from my high school debate coach, because any of us are vulnerable to this, right? And so it's really important to reject that. Respond to that, but particularly from someone who coaches debaters who spend a lot of time thinking about free speech, both about the larger problem as it exists. But one of the things we try to do on this show, James, is give people like some advice.
Yeah.
Homework assignments. So someone's sitting here listening to you, no doubt, and they're saying, man, James could really help me with X or Y. I think this might be one of the things they would like your advice on.
Sure. You of all the letters in the alphabet, X and Y was the perfect place to go, because let's talk about so-called transgenderism.
Glad I set you up well.
Right, it was perfect. We couldn't have timed that any better. This idea of biological sex, of cisgender, these are terms that if I was sitting there and advising someone who's having a good faith, honest debate, as folks should do. I was proud to see that the MIT Free Speech Alliance stood up a debate on whether sex was binary on a campus where there's been, honestly, a failure of living up to those principles of free expression. Don't let the other side control. Cisgender this, biological sex that. Even gender as a construct should be questioned. Everything should be questioned in a debate. We just got back from being at New College of Florida, which is doing great work under the leadership of the former Education Commissioner, Richard Corcoran, and under Governor DeSantis' leadership at the state level. And we had a debate about the 1994 assault weapons ban. Works out well that both President Biden and Vice President Harris have tweeted about this recently and talked about reenacting it. And I was telling students on one side of the debate, you can't let the other side just get you on that term assault weapon. What does that actually mean? Because all weapons, whether it's a hammer, whether it's your fists, whether it's a knife, can be used to perpetuate an assault. So get them on that. What does it mean to use an assault weapon? What does it mean? Because if you're now going around and saying, oh yes, let's have a debate about assault weapons, you are effectively conceding a point. You're effectively conceding a point. I'll tell you one thing that students were blown away by was the FBI national statistics that more Americans lose their lives at the hands of knives, blunt objects, and fists than they do at the hands of rifles, which, as you know, rifles even overstates the so-called assault weapons category. And so my takeaway, and I say this, I separate my views as a conservative and unapologetically so, but my views as a debater and as a leader of Incubate Debate is whatever side you're on, don't let them hijack that term. Always push back on that term, whether it's assault weapon, whether it's gender, whether it's cisgender, whatever it may be. We have to just kind of get on an even playing field here. What are we really talking about? The left is going to call it reproductive health care. and the right is going to call it life. That's the reality of it. And if I was sitting here and I was advising AOC, who might be having a debate with you, I don't know, someday, right? And I'd say, Representative Ocasio-Cortez, whatever you do, don't let Dr. Roberts call it murder. Don't concede that point. I'm unapologetically pro-life. Sure. But that's the advice that I would give her. And I would tell you the same. Don't let her call it reproductive health care. What is this idea, abortion is healthcare? What is that all about? And we can't agree to play on that playing field if there's already this one-sidedness. I'm reminded of what the National Speech and Debate Association did a couple years ago. And we are the alternative for young Americans, because they're the ones who have totally gone one-sided. They had a debate topic. Should the U.S. overturn oppressive voter ID laws? And I said, thumb on the scale too much?
A little bit.
I agree, by the way. Let's have a debate about voter ID laws. I think there are actually interesting arguments on both sides. I know you and I are persuaded one way, but as conservatives, we shouldn't fret having an honest, good faith, and open dialogue about an important issue, especially one that's rife with so much fake news. It's a technical term, right?
We ought to be confident.
We ought to be confident. And so I think this incessant desire to suppress debate actually comes from this fear from the other side that what do we actually believe in? Will this stand up to scrutiny? When Dr. Peter Hotez, the so-called epidemiologist, refused to debate RFK on the grounds that he was a conspiracy theorist and he didn't want to platform anybody. Well, first off, RFK has a platform 100 times larger than Dr. Peter Hotez. Second off, if Bobby Kennedy Jr.'s ideas are so bankrupt and so false, shouldn't you want to debate him, prove him wrong, embarrass him, as the kids say, clown on him in the public square, and once and for all put an end to so-called misinformation, disinformation? Is there an issue in this country with false ideas spreading? Well, of course there is. That's always been an issue in this country. I think as conservatives and principled rooted in the principles of classic liberalism, our response needs to be, there's always going to be things spreading around. There's always going to be fake ideas, whether it's, I think, the toxicity of critical race theory or DEI. Our answer should be to welcome a debate anytime, anywhere, and allow those ideas to be disproven, if they are, in a marketplace of ideas. That's been my biggest takeaway working with thousands of high school students across America, is that when you give students a platform to examine ideas and to defend their beliefs, they oftentimes change those beliefs, not because you want them to change, but because the first time they're being confronted by something and by someone who actually has the facts and the evidence on their side.
We need so much more of that in every arena of American life, but also in corporate boardrooms.
Yeah.
Which leads to the related issue of what you have been doing on that front as well, confronting ESG. A lot of that has to do with the left stifling free expression, even in a corporate boardroom. Tell us about that work. And of course, we will eventually talk about your book.
Yeah, absolutely. I spent 3 years working at a prominent hedge fund in New York City. I never actually was based in New York. I was remote, living in rural Florida. But I'll tell you something about New York, and it's very similar to DC, is you're not allowed to question the sacred cows. The sacred cow going into the 2016 election, perpetuated by the likes of Paul Krugman and Larry Summers, who have been wrong at every turn, is that Donald Trump was going to be the worst thing for the U.S. economy. Ever. Full stop. What did Paul Krugman say the night of the election when President-elect Trump secured victory? He said, asking himself rhetorically, when will the markets recover? First pass? Never. And now the same so-called experts are perpetuating the hoax that Donald Trump's and conservative policies are going to contribute to stagflation at a time when, by the way, look around. We've got stagflation right now.
We're living it.
We're absolutely living it. And so what I've done and what we're building is first and foremost an investment firm that is obsessed with debate, that is obsessed with rejecting the convenience of confirmation bias. This idea that we have an idea about what Donald Trump's going to do, and we're going to seek out only information that validates that and reject evidence to the contrary. Build an investment firm on that idea, but also build an investment product in an exchange-traded fund, an ETF that anybody could buy, much like they would Apple or NVIDIA. An investment fund that is committed to only investing in companies that embrace meritocracy. And so just think at a high level about this. There's a great way of thinking about investing that Warren Buffett brought up years ago, which was, don't think of investing in a company as investing in this elusive concept of a corporation, but investing in a friend. Would you invest in a friend running a small business who said, I'm going to hire the first black woman who walks in the door because that's what Davos wants me to do? Or I'm going to hire the most qualified person who walks in the door. And if that's a black woman, so be it. Good. Very good. That's fine. But the issue here is, if you would not invest in that friend who's running the pizzeria or the local law firm because they are prioritizing race and sex and, dare I say, sexual orientation over merit and qualification and intelligence and excellence, then you've got a real problem on your hands. And so what we've really done is we're going to take a universe of companies, call that the top 1,000 publicly traded companies here in the United States, and we're going to rank them, Kevin. Which companies are most committed to actually hiring, promoting, and investing human capital based on merit and merit alone? And this is a binary. If you're doing this, you are rejecting not just the toxic politics of DEI, ESG, and wokeism, but the toxic business practices. How dare a corporate executive, who, by the way, does not work for himself, he works for the shareholders, whether that's a nurse in Coeur d'Alene or a firefighter in Cincinnati, works for the shareholders. How dare he take orders from Davos? And by the way, kudos to you for giving them a run for your money, give them a run for their money and standing up and speaking truth to them.
It was a pleasure, James.
I'm sure it must have been. And as you said there, it's nothing personal.
Not at all.
It's nothing personal. This is what the American people believe. We don't want to be imposed an ideology. By the way, an ideology that could be leftist or rightist. It doesn't matter. But it just so happens to be a leftist one that's entirely void of any sort of common sense. How dare you say you're going to invest our retirement money, our money that we're putting away so when our daughter graduates and then goes on to the Marine Corps, she can come back and have something to work with to start a business, and put that into some kind of social agenda. First off, that is wrong. That is unethical. Second off, that is a terrible investment decision. It's a terrible investment decision. Our entire investment firm at Azoria, our philosophy is based on the following sentence. Companies that are committed to merit and committed to prioritizing meritocracy will outperform their woke peers that are committed to prioritizing the opposite. That is not a radical view at all.
And definitely not rocket science, which is not to take away from the importance of the idea, nor is it about left or right, liberal or conservative. It's about common sense, which we need a lot more of in this country. I'm going to ask you a couple more questions. The next one, though, has to be about the book, because our audience needs to hear about this, and I'm deeply interested in what it is, when it's coming out. Give us highlights.
So when I wrote this article in the Free Press last year, and Barry Weiss has been an incredible American to work with.
What an important person.
And an important person. Think about how many stories the Free Press has broken that it would otherwise have never been written. Had never been written if the Free Press had not broken stories about so-called gender-affirming care in St. Louis. And the New York Times was on the scene months later to corroborate it. So I give kudos to her and the entire team on really building an alternative. I'm inspired by what Barry and her team are doing. But ever since that article came out, Kevin, I was approached by folks in the publishing industry to write a book. And I didn't really know what I wanted to write. And so I wasn't keen on jumping right in. I maybe was thinking of writing a book about the collapse of high school debate, but that wasn't really going to move the needle for the country. And so how could I write something that would have impact, but also be really rigorous and take a page out of your book as a historian, look back through the depths of American history and look at the waves of anti-debatism in this country. And so I'm going to do things a little bit differently here. I've decided not to accept a deal from a major publishing house. I'm going to write this book on Substack. I'm going to announce it.
This is fascinating.
I'm going to announce it next month. This book is about debate. But for this book to be the most successful book it can be in my mind, It's got to be forged by debate. And so I'm going to put out abbreviated chapters for free on Substack every month or so. And I'm going to invite Americans from the left, from the right, from urban, rural America, wherever they are, to comment, to share their feedback. What am I doing right as I'm researching and analyzing the collapse of debate in America? And more importantly, what am I doing wrong? What am I missing? Is there some element of my analysis that isn't quite jiving with your understanding? Is there an anecdote in your life that you feel tells the story better than I'm telling it? And I'll tell you this, as folks comment and contribute and give feedback, I'm going to give them due credit when this book comes out next summer. So the book is called The War on Debate: How the Suppression of Open Debate in America Threatens Our Future. And it's all about debate, not in high school, not at what we saw in that debate stage in June, but debate as defined by the good faith clash of opposing viewpoints. Debate isn't dead in America, but it's hanging by a thread. And we have got to, as the hat says there, we've got to make debate great again if we are to make America not just great again, but greater than it's ever been. We've got to have folks from both sides step up and say, let's have an honest conversation about what's going on. We just, earlier this year, we saw a very troubling trend where Osama bin Laden's letter to America was trending on TikTok. That was disturbing. But I'll tell you, the response from TikTok, and by the knee-jerk response from a lot of conservatives, was to shut it down. My response is no. Everyone read the letter. Let's come into class on Monday. Let's have Dr. Roberts facilitate a conversation about it. The path to truth runs through open debate. The truth is, Osama bin Laden was a genocidal, diabolical man who was burning in the sixth circle of hell right now. That's the truth. But when we censor, Kevin, what we end up doing is we end up validating this belief in the eyes of many that maybe bin Laden was right about something. Let's disprove him because we know the truth is on our side. Let's invite students to read that letter and to have a good faith, open dialogue about that letter. A lot of misinformation in that letter, first and foremost, and the only way you can clear things up is through an open, honest dialogue. I've seen it many a times when we were debating the failures of COVID policy at Incubate Debate, and students had this view about the pandemic and about whether or not lockdowns were right. They were arguing that lockdowns were right, and I would ask them point blank, what percentage of people who got COVID died from COVID? And they would say, I think it was between 30 and 50%. So think about that for a second. Maybe you could actually get behind lockdowns seriously if half of people were dying from COVID, as opposed to what you and I know, which was 0.5%. 0.5% versus half of all people they think got it. And so I think so much of this radicalism, so much of this one-sidedness that we see in so many young Americans is actually rooted in just ignorance, them not knowing. You go to college campuses and you ask kids, well, what river, what sea? Well, one individual in the Wall Street Journal earlier this year actually went and asked students and said, oh, do you support this, well, from the river to the sea nonsense? And they said, yeah. Then they showed him a map. Said, all right, well, if we effectuated that river to the sea, what would happen? Well, where's Israel? Oh, it's not there anymore. Guess what happened, Kevin? 73% of students who supported that chant before seeing the map changed their mind instantly. So this idea, well, why don't we just teach people the facts, step back, and recognize that so much of this division, so much of this radicalizing is actually rooted in folks just not knowing the facts, the evidence, and the truth.
What a remarkable concept.
Yeah.
We just go back to the facts. This is the love language of anyone who works at a think tank.
Yeah.
So last question, but we'll have to do this again, maybe when the book, which will sort of be previewed on Substack, which I'm fascinated by.
Thank you.
Comes out. But maybe even before then. I'm presumed that you're hopeful about the future because of the conversation I've had with you and how you have framed things. But I usually ask guests on this show, why? Yeah. Why did you wake up this morning in spite of all the reasons to be discouraged? And, there are some. Hopeful that the country might get back on track.
Well, I'll tell you, being in D.C. doesn't give me much hope.
That is true.
That is true. Being at Heritage gives me hope.
That is also true. And thank you.
Because when I think about the folks that I see at the O'Neill's Country Buffet, where I have lunch every day in Madison, Florida, and whether they're wearing a MAGA hat or wearing a shirt supporting Vice President Harris, I see people who are deeply committed to a vision for this country that closely aligns with the conservative movement. A vision that says, we know what's best as parents, not the government. We want clean air and clean water, but we don't want to be told to buy something, to buy a car, to not be able to own a certain appliance because somebody in Paris or Davos just came up with that idea. Folks who were saying, we love capitalism, and it's not capitalism that's failing us. It's government interference in said capitalism that is failing us. People who respect the right to life, not just as I see it as a Catholic, which begins at conception, but folks who respect life for people who are dying from that scourge called the fentanyl epidemic, that poison coming across the border that's taken 80,000 Americans every single year. And so what gives me hope are Americans who are stepping up probably for the first time. And I'm proud of what Elon has done with X, creating this town square and what we used to have town squares in this country, where people are actually getting to truth. They're not having the Ministry of Truth or Facebook or the DEI department or your HR department trying to shut something down because it might offend somebody. But for the first time in a long time, they're getting to see what the other side thinks, what the other side actually thinks. They say, don't talk about this. Why can't we talk about it? Let's have an open and honest dialogue, I guess first and foremost about why we can't talk about it. And then let's be able to talk about it. Not just the path to truth, Kevin, runs through open debate, but the path to unity. You cannot have unity in America if you do not have truth. And the truth is that America is better off when we can have these conversations, where we don't resort to ad hominem attacks, where we lean on civility, where we don't necessarily walk away saying, I want to be able to persuade Kevin Roberts of my view. I just want him to understand where I'm coming from. Donald Trump is not a fascist. Donald Trump is a patriot. You may disagree, and that's okay with certain policies, but at the end of the day, there are good people. Sorry to use this phrase, on both sides. There genuinely are good people on both sides. And I think the only way we can get to that is not by these civility summits and not by, having some guest speaker tell us to just get along. We actually get to that unity by having the messy conversations of this. And I'm fortunate that Incubate is going to be a part of that movement. We're doing it. We're proud to do it, and proud to have a partner in Heritage, to have some of your staff come out and support our tournaments, but also folks from the Brookings Institute as well.
Which is so important.
We want that. We want everybody to stand up because, when we can tell kids, as we did, this is not just an issue where we want conservatives to be able to stand up for free speech. There are some progressives who are standing up for this cause. I think someone like Ro Khanna, by the way, who when I wrote this article said, it is wrong for a young girl in Brianna Watley, a young African-American girl in South Florida who was told by her judge that because she mentioned President Trump in a speech, she could not win the round because it was a debate about President Biden's foreign policy. Well, if you're going to talk about Biden, you should be able to talk about the successes under Donald Trump, whether it's the Abraham Accords, whether it was bringing North Korea to the negotiating table, whether it was getting NATO members to finally pay their fair share. And so Ro Khanna, good for him. And I can disagree with Larry Summers on a lot, but he reached out and we spoke. Good for him as well for standing up for the principles that set this country into motion in '76, set the most important guarantor of freedoms into motion in the summer of '87, and are going to write the next revolution, which I believe begins in 2024.
And it's all about recapturing institutions, good public policy, and also revitalizing debate.
Absolutely.
I've said for years that civil discourse is not the unanimity of opinion,
Right.
which a lot of people think is the definition,
Correct.
but is evidenced by people rather cheerfully, with intellectual honesty, good faith, being able to disagree with one another over important matters, maybe less important matters, and at the end of it, being willing to shake hands because they can at least understand and respect where the other person's coming from.
That's exactly right.
Thanks for everything you're doing on the investment side, on Incubate Debate. This is the kind of thing that at Heritage we mean when we say what we do with public policy might be important. What we do in terms of messaging, no doubt, is important, speaking on behalf of my colleagues. But people who are building alternative institutions understand what the solutions are for taking back the country. James Fishback, thanks for making time.
Well, thank you. Real pleasure.
You bet. I told you were in for a treat. We covered a lot of ground. We're going to cover more ground the next times we have James on the show. Thank you for making this show possible. Hopefully, you got a little pep in your step, a little encouragement, not just about the things we usually talk about like policy and politics, but more importantly, how we can have better conversations in our daily lives. Keep your chin up. We're going to win. Take care.
The Kevin Roberts Show is brought to you by more than 10 million supporters of the Heritage Foundation. The executive producer is Crystal Kate Bonham. Sound design by Lauren Evans, Mark Guiney, Tim Kennedy, and Joseph Fonsbakowski. For more information and to subscribe, please visit heritage.org.